Welcome to another episode of the Brilliant Brand Show. Today we're going to talk about consistency in a brand. How do you keep it? And what are some things that you can do to make sure that multiple departments keep the brand consistent and you stay aligned as an organization? Welcome to today's show.
This is the Brilliant Brand Show with Justin Keller, helping you fight for brilliance in your branding and marketing. The Brilliant Brand Show is powered by Circle 50 Creative.
Welcome to another episode of the Brilliant Brand Show. I'm Justin Keller, your host. Thanks for joining me today. Let's go ahead and listen to the question that came in from Donovan out of Washington State.
My name is Donovan Anderson. I'm calling from Yakima, Washington. And my question is, what is the most important aspect of maintaining brand unity and consistency and continuity through your organization when you have multiple departments that are trying to create content?
All right, Donovan, thank you for that question. The question is, how do you keep consistency in your organization when you have, multiple brands, let's say sub-brands that are all putting out content? What are some things that you can do to keep everyone consistent and keep alignment for your brand, which is a major, major struggle. I used to be on staff in an organization that had at least 20 sub-brands and probably another 15 to 20 sort of second-tier sub-brands, and they all had to communicate for their department or for their part of the organization, and keeping that consistent was a constant struggle. And there was a few things that I learned through that. First, I realized this is a big issue for any growing organization. But what happens inside of this is, as a communication team or those responsible for managing the brand, we see at a high level what's important for the organization. But you've got to understand and remember that each of the different departments in your organization see their part or their department and what they need to communicate and put out just as important, more important probably than what you're looking at, what you're seeing in front of you. And so the first thing I would want to do is just encourage you to be empathetic toward those other departments, knowing that they're being held accountable for how successful they are in engaging their audience, specific audience for the brand. And so be empathetic. You need them to be your ally, not your enemy. And I think it took me a long time to learn that. But once you learn that, you create those alignments just internally, relationally first. That actually is a big component to consistency in a brand. But know that you need them as your ally and not your enemy. And so be empathetic toward those teams and let them know like you're here to help them. And then, because what's happening is, over time, as you grow as an organization, I think inconsistency in some ways can be a sign of growth. You've outgrown some systems that you had in place, or it can also just be a sign that you had no systems in place. But over time, as you grow, inconsistency is going to creep in. And so, each of your teams are going to be trying to create their own graphics, because your communications team can only handle so much probably. And so what happens is your other departments are going to take it upon themselves to say, I can't wait for you to give us something. And they're going to just start putting out their own things. And that's, of course, where we start to see clip art appear in our emails, or we start to see just the most random things that, as a brand manager or someone responsible for the communication, there's nothing worse than that. And so these are real issues, Donovan, and you're not alone in that. And so your question specifically, though, was what's the most important aspect to focus on to bring consistency to multiple departments? So if I had to pick two areas, Donovan, it would be the voice and the visuals. Those are two of the most important things that you're going to have when it comes to your communication. Of course, the voice, that's obvious. And then visually how that appears. But before I go into some ways that you can actually do that, I want to give us a little example and talk about Coke. They recently did a rebrand and did what's called a one brand strategy, and where Coke Life, Coke Light, I think Coke Life is just a substitute sugar version of it. Coke Light, basically Diet Coke, Coke Zero, no sugar, and then Coke, all are now being underneath one brand strategy and marketing campaigns along with that. So when they went through this, I think there's some things we can learn from it, and one big takeaway for you. But I want to read you the quote from their chief marketing officer, Marcos de Quinto. and he said this: Coca-Cola is one brand with different variants, all of which share the same values and visual iconography. People want their Coca-Cola in different ways, but whichever one they want a Coca-Cola brand with great taste and refreshment. I think the biggest takeaway from that quote that I want us to think about in the context of the rest of this show is that you're one brand. I know you have multiple departments, but you're one brand with different departments, not different values and not different standards for what you communicate and how you communicate it and visually how that should feel. And so instead of seeing every department as its own brand, it's important to align everybody on the idea of we are one brand. This organization is the brand, not a bunch of different brands with different values and different methods and strategies inside of each of those. And so Coca-Cola, whether or not this plays out to be the right strategy for a lot of other reasons, the one thing I do appreciate about that, what they've done, is they at least have the mindset of we're one brand. So yeah, it tastes a little different if you're drinking Diet Coke, which I would not recommend, than it tastes when you're drinking just Coke, regular Coke, the original Coke. But at the end of the day, it's Coca-Cola. And so think about your organization as one brand is where I would start by saying. But let's talk about some practical ways that you can actually bring consistency now to those sub-brands that you have inside of this one organization. So one of those, the first starting points for any organization, and it might not be a new idea for you, you may have heard it talked about, but I don't see these living inside of organizations as strong as they could. And one would be the brand standard. Have you created a document that states how the logo should be used, how it shouldn't be used, the colors and when and why and where to use these colors versus, when and where and why not to use these colors. Your brand standard or brand guidelines should include all of that for even those sub-brands that you have inside of your organization, how their logos should be used on print, how big it should be used, how small it should be used, never smaller than this, how it should be used on social. There's so many different parameters that need to be provided to these teams to help them be equipped, because I understand as a communications team, you can't necessarily hold their hand and do everything for them. There's going to be times they just need to put out their own content, their own communication. But if you don't have that brand standard, they are not following any rules, and that's on you as a communication team or as a brand management team. If you haven't given them the rules and guidelines to follow, you can't expect consistency. So there's some items that need to be inside of that. You can include, what fonts to use, when and why, again, and then even the tone of the brand and what you communicate, the language you use, that can all live inside of this brand standard. And every single person, when they're onboarded to your organization, should be given this. Like, this is our brand, the identity, the voice, and even the visual, the way we present ourselves. So this is for you to have. You're a manager of this brand. You're expected to, adhere to these guidelines. And so you should include even inside of that photography style or, set rules. You can't use, maybe you can't use your iPhone for videos if you're putting it out to, if it's a public thing. If it's an internal video, great. External videos, we require that it goes through this department. So anyway, just creating the standard for how things need to look and sound and feel. If you haven't done that, you can't expect consistency. So that's an easy thing to do, or starting point at least. It does take some time, but that's an easy starting point. Second, I would suggest quarterly communication strategies. If you want to do annual or do it, a year at a time, that's fine. But a lot of inconsistency is just happening because there's not great internal communication between those who are having to live and execute and implement the brand inside of their department and those of us who maybe are managing the brand as a communications team. And so one of the ways that you can break down that lack of communication, that barrier that exists now on between the departments, would be create a quarterly communication strategy meeting where you sit down and say, okay, what do you have coming up? What needs to be communicated? All right, and even help them think through what are they communicating and how and why inside of those. You get them on the same page before they need it. That's the biggest takeaway from this is don't wait till, a lot of times we're week to week. This team is asking for this or this department needs that. If you do sit down with them each quarter and go over this, they'll have the game plan for the high priority items already and already had your input so that you can focus, your team can stay focused on executing the higher level items, but you've made each team feel like they're important and what they have matters, because it does. Each part of the organization matters and each department is a priority. It just maybe isn't the communications team's priority always. So creating those, and inside of that, I would just say one of the strategies that I used to use would be, I would set aside a 2-day window where I literally just focused on that department and knocked out their stuff for the quarter. If you can do that, that's one way to make sure that they're equipped, you've controlled it a little bit, or let them send it to you, to review ahead of time. If they've spent the first week of the quarter working on it, let them send that to you to review, and then they can execute it the rest of the quarter. And also, don't be afraid to to outsource it. This is something that, as your organization grows, I don't think it's possible for you, unless you have just the biggest budget to work with. It's not always possible for you to manage your own brand, every part of it, or every team department as it grows. And so, this is something that we do for a lot of organizations, where they'll give us one area of their brand to focus on and to do all the communication for it, so that they can keep moving forward on some of the higher level items, or vice versa. We'll handle the high level items and they are doing the day-to-day with all their departments. And because you do need each of these pieces moving forward, but it's expensive to try to staff that internally to the, at least the type of caliber person that you want and that you can trust to know they're going to do this right. So don't be afraid to outsource and get some help. It can really be valuable. Number one, you're going to get a different perspective on all of the things that you're doing, but it can still be consistent with the organization, and it makes it easier for your team internally managing the brand, but it also makes those who you need to be your allies, all the other departments, feel like their needs are getting taken care of, and without straining the budgets and without straining your team's efforts. So, and then the third thing is this, last thing would be, you have to prioritize, and consistency really starts with the top of the organization prioritizing for the teams what needs to be communicated. So a lot of times we're just moving forward as an organization with everything's a priority. And when everything's a priority, you've heard it before, but nothing is a priority. And so at the top of the organization, you've got to determine, hey, what are the essentials for our organization? What do we communicate? Why do we communicate it? And so what does that require for each of these departments? And so, one of the things that, just a practical thing that you can do, and this was shown to me by a mentor in my life years ago. I went to him and said, hey, I've got all these different departments. I can't keep any of them happy. They're turning into my enemy. We're not allies right now. What are some things that I can do to help make sure that they're taken care of? And it really helped when we applied this rule. So what we started to do is we looked at, okay, inside of each department, what you're about to communicate, you have to ask yourself, what's our reach? Okay, so let's pretend that your reach is 50 people for this event. Well, if your whole audience potential is 10,000, 50 people is not a high priority item. That's more of an internal strategy that's required. And so by prioritizing this, you're able to say, hey, for 50 people, when you're reaching 50 to 100 people only, this does not require an organization-wide email blast. This does not require a video being shot. This does not require, whatever that looks like. But what it does take is you should send out an email, and you should maybe even when you see them be able to give them something in hand, but we're not going to print it in color. It's only in black and white. These were the rules that we put in place. And so I would encourage you to do that and give your teams some rules for what they can expect from the communications team. So for this type of event, man, this is organization-wide. And so it's going to get an email blast. It's going to get social media presence. We're going to create graphics for this. It's going to get a logo for this event. But you have to establish that priority at the top of the organization. You have to have buy-in from the top. And so, Donovan, to answer the question, the simplest way is, one, making sure you have that brand standard, and having a quarterly communication strategy would be another way. Aligning everybody along, the strategy that we're going to have, what we're going to communicate, and then bringing consistency by prioritizing the level and the degree of how they communicate the specific things for their organization. And so not everything needs graphics. Sometimes something just needs a text to a certain group, or just an email blast to just that audience instead of the whole list. So knowing the priority, having that brand standard, and then getting the internal communication going between departments on a quarterly strategy that we're all aligned around. Those are good starting points for a brand to try to bring some consistency. Of course, you're going to have the struggle of, hey, they want to have some parameters, they want some freedom, but I think there are some simple ways that you can control this, and starting with those would be a great starting point for your organization. So I hope that helps you. And if you have questions about, branding and marketing for me and for another episode, and you want it featured on the show, just go ahead to circle50.com/Q&A and submit your question. And in return, I'm going to go ahead and send you a digital version of my book, Rebel Brands, 10 New Rules for Building Brilliant Brands. And if you're digging the content that we're putting out with the show, just want to encourage you, share it with some other people that you think it's relevant for. And feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll get a text probably on your phone. I know I've seen that we get updated when the new show goes live with other ones we subscribe to. And so that day, you'll get informed when the show goes live. So if you're digging the content, it's helping you, please subscribe. We'd appreciate it. And I just appreciate you joining in to this show today. And remember, brilliance isn't complicated, and don't choose stupid.
If you would like to have your question featured on the show, just visit circle50.com/Q&A, and in return, we'll send you a free digital copy of Justin's book, Rebel Brands, 10 New Rules for Building Brilliant Brands. The Brilliant Brands Show is powered by Circle 50 Creative. Find your untold brilliance and make your purpose matter with the right message, visuals, and marketing. Learn more at circle50.com.